So, it's been 2 weeks since we were in class. I apologize for the break last week, but I feel much better after a rather sloppy week last week. As best I recall, we had just come to the Queen of Sheba in 1 Kings chapter 10 and 2 Chronicles chapter 9. And the accounts of the Queen of Sheba given there are almost parallel, almost word for word parallels. Very, very similar accounts there. 1 Kings 10, 1 through 13, 2 Chronicles chapter 9, 1 through 12. No significant differences between the two accounts. And it's interesting that the writer of Chronicles, whose primary focus really is to record the legitimacy of Judah's kings, includes this little vignette, this little insight into Solomon's wisdom. The writer of Chronicles does not emphasize the folly of Solomon the way the writer of Kings does. But of course, the writer of Chronicles has a different focus, that is the legitimacy, the genuineness of Judah's kings versus Israel's versus idolatrous kings of other nations and so forth. So you look at the Queen of Sheba here, and she is from Sheba or Saba. She appears to be a Sabaean queen, and Sabea is an Arabian area, an Arabian kingdom of that era. The capital city was called Saba. Oddly enough, she's mentioned in the Quran in Surah 27, and according to the Quran, her proper name was actually Balkis, B-A-L-K-I-S, which that may or may not be of any significance to us. She came to prove him with hard questions, or in other words, with riddles. And Middle Eastern peoples, Arabians in particular, but Middle Eastern peoples are generally known for their love of wordplay and riddles. It's not an accident that there is actually a lot of wordplay in the Hebrew of the Old Testament. You think about the 119th Psalm, 176 verses, longest contiguous passage in the scriptures, longest chapter as we would count things. And what do you have in the 119th Psalm? On one hand, you have an extensive treatise on respect and reverence for God's word. Every stanza, and there are 22 stanzas, each stanza corresponds to a letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and each line in each stanza in the Hebrew language begins with a word that begins with that particular letter of the alphabet. So it's a memory device so that a Hebrew speaker could fairly easily memorize all 176 verses of the 119th Psalm. That's the kind of wordplay and poetry and fascination with things that is very characteristic of Middle Eastern peoples in particular. Now, the Sabaeans, the Queen of Sheba, these were people who in ancient times were notable for their wealth, particularly in precious stones. Their wealth was not so much in silver and gold and bronze and brass and precious metals, but in precious stones, diamonds and emeralds and rubies and so forth. And it's not that they were sitting on a huge diamond mine or something of that sort. They were traders, and that was their precious stones, if you'll pardon the expression, were their stock in trade. That's where they made their money. And no doubt, this woman was, in a roundabout way, the source of some of Solomon's precious stones. No doubt she must have brought some of them to him. You look at verse 3 in 2 Chronicles chapter 9, and you find her astonishment. Solomon answers every riddle that she poses. He answers every question. You look at 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 3. He answered all her questions, told her all her questions. There was not anything hidden from the king. She couldn't come up with a puzzle or a riddle or a question or a problem that he couldn't explain. Now, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that previously, as we look at the wisdom of Solomon, what areas of knowledge does Solomon's wisdom span? Solomon has moral understanding, right and wrong, the ability to adjudicate hard cases and difficult problems and things of that sort. But also, if you'll recall, we read that Solomon was given wisdom and understanding of the natural world, animals and plants and things like that. There may well have been understanding of things medical and agrarian, agricultural, of that sort, that effectively died with Solomon, that no other person had up to his time that God had endowed him with. But here, this woman comes, she's heard about him, she wants to know, surely this can't be true, and she's not the only one. Remember that the rulers of surrounding nations as well had consulted with him and were amazed by his wisdom. And so in verses 4 and 5 here in 1 Kings chapter 10, basically you have royalty judging royalty, royalty sitting in judgment on royalty. She's evaluating everything she sees, the quality of the food on his tables, the bearing of his servants, the opulence of his palace, the contentment of his people, and so forth. Remember, for the 40 years of his reign, Solomon largely has peace. Now, you get to the second half, the second 20 years of Solomon's reign, and things are not going to be uniformly peaceful. But for the most part, his rule is characterized by peace and prosperity. And that was unusual, especially for that long a period of time in the ancient world. Yes, ma'am.
A question, back to her questions or her the things that she asked him about. Do any of the commentators or anybody have any speculation on, were the questions of a spiritual nature, or were they of a civil nature? Like, how do we solve these problems with our people, or do we have any?
Okay, for those of you online, the question is, do any of the commentators or scholars have any insight as to the character of the Queen of Sheba's questions? Were they moral questions? Were they legal questions? Were they practical, political? How do we solve this? How do we deal with that kind of questions? I'm sure that you can find commentators that will speculate on that. For what it's worth, that's all it could be, is speculation, because the only inspired source we have here in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, and the Holy Spirit doesn't see fit to give us any details of her questions. Now, if you, and I think we mentioned this last time a couple of weeks ago, if you go back to Cecil B. DeMille and Louis B. Mayer and all those guys that made the biblical epics in film back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there was a romantic liaison between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. There is zero here in the scriptures to suggest that. Nothing here at all. But you look at verses 6 and 7, and her assessment of things is that he's twice as good as everything that she's ever heard about him. Why had she come to meet him face to face in the first place? Because she'd heard tales of Solomon that were just more than she could wrap her head around. Nobody can be that wise. Nobody can be that smart. Nobody can be that prosperous. Nobody can be that good to his people. No king's people can be that content and that happy. And she comes to see for herself. And her summation, the half has not been told. It's twice as good as I thought it could be, as it was even claimed to be. Now, notice down here at verse 8, happy are thy men, happy are these thy servants, which stand continually before thee, and that hear thy wisdom. In other words, these servants, she's not talking about just the guys waiting on the table and so forth, not menial servants, but rather his ministers, his ministers of state, his ambassadors and his counselors and so forth. There's you an interesting thought. Solomon has counselors, but of all things, who's the greatest counselor in his court? He is. You do sort of have to wonder, okay, what good is a counselor to an inspired wise man? And I have to wonder about that. But happy, content, blessed. Here is a beatitude of sorts in the records of Kings and Chronicles. Blessed are your servants, your ministers of state and so forth, who get to hear your wisdom. Think about this. Being in Solomon's court, being a servant in Solomon's court, even being just a menial servant in Solomon's court, must have been like an everyday university education in some ways. Just to hear what he had to say on any given subject must have been an extraordinary thing. And so she says, the half has not been told. You get down to verse 9, she acknowledges the God of Israel. Blessed is the Lord your God, which delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore, he made you king to do what? To do judgment and justice. To do judgment and justice. There's the fundamental responsibility of any civil leader. You might go out in the margin there next to verse 9 and just draw a little arrow out into the margin and write in Romans chapter 13. The fundamental responsibility of a civil leader. Judgment and justice, to do justly for his people. Now, as you go on in verses 11 and 12, in verse 10, her gifts to him match her appraisal. She gives him extravagant gifts, extravagant wealth, which by his standards is just, okay, thanks, appreciate that. She's not going to make him wealthy. He's already fabulously wealthy and going to become more so with or without her help. Now, consider, she came for what reason?
To test him.
She came to test him. She came to see if he could really be as wise, as smart, as inspired as he is. But what's another very reasonable, logical purpose in her coming and meeting Solomon and testing him and getting acquainted with him?
Please don't take over my country.
Well, now it on one hand, it might be a political overture. Don't take over my country. Don't push yourself upon me, as it were. But the Sabaeans are far enough away. That's probably not a major concern. But remember how the Sabaeans get their wealth. They're fundamentally traders. And where does Solomon's wealth primarily come from? Solomon's wealth, with God's help, is based in trade. He is the consummate merchant king. And so you think about her basis, her background, and his background. This is politically a good thing for her. This is certainly is morally and spiritually a good thing for her. But in terms of commerce and trade, good relations with Solomon would be a good thing for her, because they would both make out profitably from a good relationship here. So she lays out what to us would be an extravagant gift. I won't say a bribe, but certainly an offering entitled or intended to entice him into a good relationship, good trade relationship with her. And then look down here at verses 11 and 12. The navy also of Hiram that brought gold from Ophir brought in from Ophir great plenty of almond trees and precious stones. And the king made almond trees of the almond trees pillars for the house of the Lord, and so on and so forth. This seems to be how she had heard of him in the first place, through trade and connection with Hiram, through the give and take of commerce. And though she gives him extravagant gifts, look down to verse 13. How does this wind up? Solomon gave her whatever she asked. He gave her extravagant gifts himself. So you come to chapter 10 then, the balance of chapter 10, and what you have here is a measure really of Solomon's great wealth, Solomon's splendor as king. And this compares to 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 15, and then the balance of 2 Chronicles chapter 9. You pick up at verse 13. And we talk about the shields that are made here. The weight of the gold that came into Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents, verse 14 in 1 Kings chapter 9. This is an extravagant volume, an extravagant amount, more than most kingdoms would take in. And this is just in a year for Solomon. There are shields made in verses 16 and 17, 200, and then 300 more smaller ones. And they're put in the house of the forests of Lebanon. These are decorative in some respects, overlaid with gold, but then also they're not just a decorative display, they're a ceremonial thing. Now, the King James uses the words bucklers and shields. A buckler is a larger shield. It's intended for the protection of the entire body. The regular shield would have been a smaller, more of a handheld thing, rather than to build a phalanx wall or something of that sort. It would be carried and used to protect the face and the head primarily. But still, to produce these and to overlay them with precious metal, that just describes extraordinary wealth. Look down to verses 18 through 20. And here, the king also made a great ivory throne and overlaid it with the finest of gold. 6 steps. At the back of the throne was a calf's head. On each side of the seat were armrests, 2 lions standing beside the armrest. 12 lions stood there, one on each end of a step on the 6 steps. The like of it was never made in any kingdom. You have to wonder about this a little bit. That really doesn't actually speak well of Solomon, does it? No doubt it's impressive. And certainly the symbolism of the lion, in one sense, would be appropriate. Go back to Genesis chapter 49 and Jacob's prophecy about Judah. Judah is what? Judah is a lion's cub, a lion's whelp. But go back to Exodus 20. Go back to the repetition of the commandments in Deuteronomy. You shall make how many graven images of things? None. And here you've got a calf's head on the back of the throne, and then lions' heads on the arms, and 6 crouching lions on each side of the steps. I have no doubt it was hugely impressive. But you have to wonder, what did the priests think? What did they say? Or did they say anything? It's interesting that this is not brought up as being an issue or a violation of the law, as far as we know. It's not mentioned here as being an offense.
Well, weren't like we were talking about, the cherubim carved images? Weren't there
those
images on the curtain?
Yes, inside the temple, there were a number of carved images,
yeah.
But those were by the express instruction of God. There's no indication that this was. All we see here at the end of verse 20, the like of it was never made in any kingdom. There's never been another throne like this. And you think about it, this is ivory overlaid with gold. This is extravagance on a ridiculous scale, in a manner of speaking.
Talk about the calf's head.
I can't find
This is, let me back up here.
Yeah, I got the line.
chapter, 1 Kings chapter 10, and we are at verses 18, 19, and 20. That's the English Standard rendering. It may be different in the King James.
It's got a round top to the
Yeah,
throne, and
that's
it's
what
weird.
19 says.
That's the
Yeah.
American Standard.
Okay.
Yeah, you can jump says that too, round at the back.
Okay, yeah, the King James says, the king made a great throne of ivory, overlaid it with finest gold, 6 steps to the throne, top of the throne was round behind, and there were stays on either side by the place of the seat and 2 lions standing for. I hadn't noticed that difference between the translations.
The English Standard says calf.
English Standard says a calf's head. I hadn't noticed that difference between the translations. That's interesting.
Big-
Yeah, it is. Goes back to the distinction sometimes in the Hebrew language, though. You look down at verses 21, 2, and 3, and the whole point here is that Solomon acquires wealth just to excess, to the point that it's nothing out of the ordinary. More than any other nation, verse 23, King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. Silver is so plentiful. I mean, gold is so plentiful that silver basically has no value in his kingdom. He has exotic animals, exotic livestock, apes, peacocks, things like that. He must have had a zootin. That seems, it's funny. That seems to be something that every great ruler and every would-be great ruler wants to have as a display of how extraordinary I am. Look at the strange beasts I can acquire. Who else can do this but me? And that just throughout history, you find that seems to be one of the symbols of people in positions of authority with inflated egos, is to collect rare and peculiar things. But you go on down here at verse 26, he has a huge cavalry spread all over the kingdom. You find references to that back in chapter 4. You find also in 2 Chronicles chapter 1 and later on in chapter 9. Look at verse 27 here in 1 Kings chapter 10. At verse 27, the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of Shephelah. That's a figure of speech. It's a hyperbole. It was such an opulent environment, such a rich atmosphere, that things that normal folks would just be blown away by, they were just commonplace and taken for granted in Jerusalem. Think of it in modern terms. Think of it like a little bit like the Russian oligarchs right now over in the Eastern Europe, who are madly spending their wealth buying luxury goods and Rolls Royces and Bentleys and yachts and so forth, because they're seeing the value of their rubles just losing value. And so they're madly trying to acquire things that will retain some value. And these are things that they would take for granted otherwise. Rolls Royce, not a big deal, it's just a car. Well, yeah, it is just a car, but it's a ridiculously expensive car. A yacht, well, who owns a, Jim has a yacht in his garage. It's about 12 feet long and about 3 feet wide, and he built it himself. Well,
Tell yourself that, Jim.
wealth was just so common that they didn't even think about it in Solomon's Jerusalem.
Evan,
Go ahead, Jim.
what would they be trading? What would they be sending out to receive all this stuff in?
That's a good question. What do they have to trade with? Well, if you look at past history, what has traditionally been the wealth of the Israelite people in terms of tradable goods? Livestock, sheep, cattle, grain. It is a land, as God told Moses, that flows with milk and honey. It is a productive land, and those are commodities that other people would need. You think about the Sabaeans living down in the Arabian desert. You're going to get tired of camel's milk and camel cheese and smoked camel after a while. So they would trade for foodstuffs and so forth, as well as precious stones and things. Solomon could certainly trade with the Phoenicians, the Philistines over on the coast, for fish and things of that sort, because you live on the coast, you get tired of fish after a while. Now, we would look at that and say, but these are not things that are worth that much. But what else does Solomon have to bring to the table? He also has his wisdom. Does Solomon trade on his wisdom? Does he serve as advisor, as counselor to other kings? I don't know. Even if he does not, just the trade agreements that he makes, because of his wisdom, are going to be to his advantage. Think of the guy that effectively can look at the stock market and predict where it's going to go. He's going to make a lot of money even on just ordinary commodities, isn't he? Because he's got insight that other people don't have. Solomon, in practical terms, Solomon is that guy. Now, for what it's worth, Solomon did have other things in which he could trade. In the Negev, in the desert south of Palestine, of the land of Canaan, there are copper mines that date back to Solomon's era. And the more that is discovered, the more it appears that they actually yielded vast quantities of copper. Now, copper for us is a semi-precious metal. We used to make pennies out of it because it's not nearly as valuable as nickel or silver, or certainly as gold. But on the other hand, what's copper necessary for? Well, in the modern world, copper is necessary for wiring, but in the ancient world, what else did you use copper for? Copper is not, there you go. Copper is not a precious metal, but it's a lot harder than silver or gold, and alloyed with tin and antimony and things of that sort. You can make brass and bronze. And remember, the Israelites, when they came into the land of promise, they were basically a Bronze Age people, and their weapons and their tools were primarily from Egypt and of Egyptian technology, which was a Bronze Age culture. So they come into the land of promise, and they have copper mines, and they smelt copper in the days of the kings. But the Phoenicians, the Philistines, and the others who are off to the west along the coast and up in the mountains to the north of them, the Syrians, they're Iron Age people. And so some of this trade is undoubtedly this semi-precious metal for this far more durable metal, iron, so that they can make better quality tools, better quality implements, and better quality weapons.
Sure.
Chariots. There you go.
It sounds in verse 29 like he was sort of an arms dealer.
Yeah.
Supplied to other nations' kings.
And you are exactly right. You look at the last verse of 1 Kings chapter 10. Among other things, what did Solomon trade in? Weapons, chariots, horses, arms. Yeah, he's in some ways he's an arms dealer, which in its own right in our modern world raises a question. Well, how is that ethical? Well, the weapon itself is morally neutral. What you do with it is the issue. And that's, Solomon here, through the king's traders, they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. So all this stuff travels across this territory. One other thing to remember is that when we talk about the source of Solomon's wealth, in many ways, the foundation of Solomon's wealth is his location. Because the territory of Israel, remember, Solomon expands even on what David controlled. But the territory of Israel throughout history has been a crossroads. It is in many respects, it's the land bridge between Africa and Europe and Asia. And so trade routes back to the days of Abraham and before crisscross this land. All Solomon has to do to get rich is just charge a percentage, basically operate a toll road through the territory, and he's going to eat good the rest of his days. Go ahead, Mike.
I wouldn't underestimate his, especially the grain.
Mhm.
Several hundred years before, through God, Joseph saw something coming. Famines haven't stopped. They're still occurring at this time.
That's right.
And Joseph amped up Pharaoh of Egypt's wealth multiple fold.
Yeah,
Because everybody had to come down now.
there you
You don't
go.
care about copper and gold and silver and iron when you're starving to death.
That's right.
Now you'll give all of that away to get your hands
To
on
have a
what
meal.
Solomon has in abundance now.
There you
So
go.
that could be part of how he got some of this.
There you go. Mike is making the point that just Solomon's ability to produce grain and foodstuffs in its own right is a source of wealth, simply because famines haven't stopped and droughts haven't stopped. And when people are hungry, they'll pay inflated prices just to fill their bellies. And so Solomon, with a little insight from the Lord, certainly is able to provide for just such moments as that. Well, as we move forward, though, chapter 11 in 1 Kings, chapter 10 in 2 Chronicles marks the tipping point of Solomon's kingdom. And here's where things go from ascending and improving and growing and prospering to beginning to decline. Now, at what point over the 40-year span of Solomon's reign does this take place? I don't know. Is this at the halfway mark? Has he ruled for 25 or 30 years at this point? Is this early on, 10, 15 years in? I don't know. But the whole tone and tenor of things changes dramatically at the end of 2 Chronicles 9 and at the beginning of 1 Kings chapter 11. Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh. And notice who is included in these people, in these women. Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them. He married women he was not supposed to marry. So things begin to decline. Now, problem number one, polygamy. Solomon's father David practiced polygamy, had probably a dozen or more wives over the course of his time on the throne. Saul, David's predecessor, practiced polygamy, and David inherited his wives and concubines. And one of the things Nathan rather, takes David to task for in 2 Kings chapter 13, 12 and 13 is, God says, look, if that wasn't enough, I'd have given you more. And instead, what'd you do? You went and stole Bathsheba to add to your collection. No good result ever proceeds from polygamy in itself. Now, God is able to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. No problem there. God is able to use the misbehavior of men to bring about good results in spite of the men. He did that with Bathsheba giving birth to Solomon. But polygamy, though it is tolerated by God in Old Testament times, is never, ever in itself a blessing to those who practice it. It's never a good thing in its own right. Now, notice the phraseology that says here, Solomon clung to these women in love. This is married love. It's the same term that's used in the Old Testament for the love of the Lord. Love of Jehovah, love for Jehovah. These are described as princesses. They're elevated to wives of the first class. These are not just random concubines in a harem. These are women put in positions of honor, positions of respect. And these are idolatrous women. They're not necessarily women of royal birth, but they're put into positions of authority, positions of respectability in the kingdom, even though they're not entitled to it. And you find the summation of their influence at the end of verse 3. They turned away his heart. 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. They turned away his heart. This was not a good influence on him. If ever there is a testimony in the scriptures to the power of a wife over her husband, much less the power of many wives over their husband, here it is. Now, one thing worth pointing out here, the first wife of whom we read is the Egyptian princess, the daughter of Pharaoh. And nothing in the scripture tars her with this stigma of having turned away his heart from the Lord. And to marry an Egyptian was not a violation of the law. Egyptians were not among those people that Israelites were forbidden to marry. But these women were. So you look at verses 4 through 8, here's the impact of this relationship. They turned away his heart from following God. When Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God. Now, what you have here is a picture of divided loyalty, a picture of a man who, on the one hand, knows beyond any shadow of doubt that his wisdom, his power, his wealth, his position are due to the Lord. No question about it. He has spoken to God personally. But on the other hand, he's actively engaged in violating the foundation of Israel's law basis with God. I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods besides me. And he's worshiping, offering sacrifices, engaged in the religion of false gods. Now, this takes place when he's old. How old? I don't know. I don't know where in the arc of his reign this occurs. But it says that he went after the Ashtoreth, the goddesses of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites, and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He's divided in his loyalties. Think about Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6. What does Jesus say in Matthew 6 and verse 24? No man can do what? Serve two masters. It's not possible to be faithful to God and engaged in idolatry. Now let's think about a 21st century application of this. What competes in our lives today, or in the lives of people we know, for space and time that rightly belongs to God? We don't find Christians today being enticed to give 40% of their time and their loyalty and their faithfulness to Allah and pretend to be Muslim 40% of the time. We don't find Christians today who are sucked into worshiping the deities of Buddhism on Fridays and Saturdays, and then coming in to worship the Lord God on Sundays. But what do we find?
Worship of money.
Money,
Entertainment.
entertainment. I have to see this concert. I have to see this movie. I have to see this television program. I have to go here, do that, Disney World, what have you. Universal Studios. Is there anything wrong with any of those things in their own right?
No.
No. Until they begin to take away loyalty and faithfulness and service to God. You said something else. I think I know what you said.
Pleasure.
Pleasure. What
Gotta be
falls into the category of pleasure?
A lot.
A lot, yeah.
Isn't it really worship of self is really the core of
There
everything?
you go. That really is what it amounts to, is worship of self's desires. Is that not idolatry as much as what Solomon was doing? Now, let's take that and flip that over and look at the underbelly of it for a second. Does that mean if the worship of personal desire and pleasure is tantamount to idolatry, does that mean then that if I deny myself, that makes me more virtuous simply because I'm denying myself?
No, if your heart's not right.
Not if your heart's not right. What was yesterday in the calendar of Christendom?
No, Lent.
Wednesday.
Okay, Tuesday was Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday. Yesterday is Ash Wednesday. What's today?
Thursday.
Maundy Thursday. And that makes tomorrow what? Good Friday. Leading up to what? Where is all this pageantry and pomp and whatnot going?
Is Easter on Sunday?
It's
No.
going toward it. No, this coming Sunday is not Easter,
That's
Good
not the
Friday,
Good
other way,
Friday.
is it Sunday?
but
Good Friday's before Easter.
you're right. I've got the wrong Friday there. But as we're moving forward through the pageantry and so forth of modern Christendom, what are we seeing here? We're seeing the worship of the process. We're seeing the worship of all of these things that are substitutes for what God has actually prescribed. And this is all leading up to what that is going to then precede Easter. Lent. Lent, the Lenten season, as Christendom, and particularly the Catholic and Anglican and Lutheran denominations would describe it. What do we associate through our family and friends that are involved in this? What do we associate with Lent?
Doing without something surprising.
You got to give up something for Lent. Jim, what are you going to give up for Lent?
Cookies.
Cookies. Mike, what are you going to give up for Lent?
I'm gonna stick with my religion. Thank you.
We laugh because we see this is absurd. How much of a sacrifice is it to give up cookies for a few days? Well, now,
Wait a minute now. Whoa.
for some folks, maybe it's more than others. But if I give up, if I give up beef jerky for the next 3 weeks or 3 months or for the next year, does that make me a holier person just because I have given up something?
putting ash on your head. I saw a commentator on TV yesterday with ash on his head.
Yeah. If you watch the news yesterday, you'd have seen some of the folks with the mark of the cross in ashes on their heads and all of the ceremony and so forth that's associated with that. But that brings us back to this fundamental thing. None of these things that we're talking about, Solomon's wealth, his prestige, his power, his position, none of those was inherently evil. But when his heart was turned away from God to those other things, his heart was separated from God. And when our hearts are separated, even only in part from God, what did Jesus say? No man can do what? Serve two masters. And really the picture Jesus is painting there in words is of a man who's trying to walk a tightrope, as it were, holding on to God with one hand and holding on to mammon, worldly things, with the other hand, and trying to keep from being pulled off either way. And you know what's going to happen when you do that? God lets go. And the world's going to pull you right off on its side. Well, that's what happens to Solomon here. Solomon tries to straddle the fence, as it were. God lets go. And Solomon falls in sin.
Is he most likely trying to please these women and
Okay.
allowing them to have these? So he's letting women, or another person at this point, take that place of God, because he's really, I'd rather please you than follow him. So is that really, that's really what he's kind of doing here, isn't it?
Go back and look at verse 7, or verse 4 rather. His wives turned away his heart after other gods. They evidently wore on him and nagged on him and begged on him and pleaded with him. They're importuning him, wore him down. And he went after other gods. Now, at verse 5, that phraseology is unmistakable. Solomon was actually engaged in this activity. He didn't simply permit them. He participated with them. And his acceptance of his wives' pleading and his building them places for worship is counted as idolatry. Now, think about this. When something wrong is taking place and we do not speak or act to condemn it, to prevent it, what have we just done? We have sinned because we've approved it. You know, Edmund Burke is quoted as saying all that's necessary for the forces of evil to triumph is that good men do nothing. But long before Burke, what did James write by inspiration in James 4 and verse 17? That's right. Therefore, to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. You go on and look at James chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, and there, let no man say when he's tempted, I'm tempted by God, etc., etc. God cannot be tempted, neither does he tempt any man, but each man is drawn away by his own lust and enticed, and here's where it leads. Go ahead, Jim.
At the end of Romans chapter 1, the last two verses talking about it. A whole list of bad things, backbiters, haters of God,
Yeah.
roasters, so forth. It says, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of them.
There you go. So you come to the last two verses of Romans chapter 1, and there the Apostle Paul, by inspiration, points out that those engaged in the ungodliness, the unrighteousness of the ancient Gentiles, not only were condemned for their own sin, but they were condemned also for approving sin in others as well, endorsing, encouraging, and approving. And here's where Solomon winds up. And so you look down here at verses 9 through 13, and what happens? Solomon is rejected by God. It says that the Lord was angry with Solomon. Angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep the Lord's commandment. Now, it's important for us to make the point here. Solomon does not appear to have ceased, at least in his own mind, all reverence for and respect for and worship for God. The morning and evening sacrifices took place every day, right there next door to his palace. And he was party to it. You know, he is undoubtedly still engaged in providing the sacrifices and making offerings and so forth. And how does God view that?
Well, not worship me at all.
Yeah, it does. As you said, it doesn't matter. God's assessment is, you've turned away from me. If you're not 100% dedicated to me, you're not 99% dedicated to me. You're not 80%, 50%. Anything less than 100% doesn't count, basically. And so God is angry. And so he speaks. Since this has been your practice. Look at his words here. Since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Yet, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. So God foretells, all right, I am going to split your kingdom. Think about this. Solomon, at the pinnacle of his power, undoubtedly the most reverenced, respected, honored king of his day, wealthy beyond imagination, wielding influence far outsized to the actual size of his realm. Solomon, whose other name is what? Jedediah, meaning beloved of the Lord. Solomon, the child whose birth is proof to David and Bathsheba that they have been forgiven. Solomon, the son chosen by David, according to God's will, to be his successor. Solomon, whose son Rehoboam surely is the apple of his eye because he's going to be his successor. And God tells him, I'm going to take a whole lot of this away. And your kingdom is never going to be the same again because of what you have done. God rejects Solomon because he had not kept his commandments. Now, it won't take place during Solomon's lifetime. And there will be a tribe left for the heir of Judah to rule. But that's not because of anything Solomon's done. That's because of David and for the sake of Jerusalem, because God has bigger plans. Now, notice though, as God speaks here, look at how he phrases this and the implication of what he says here. He says, since this has been your practice, verse 11, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Now, Solomon is going to complete 40 years. Solomon is going to be roughly 60 years old, younger actually than his father when he dies, as far as we can tell. Had Solomon remained faithful, how long do you suppose he might have ruled? Everything was going good until he gave in to his idolatrous wives. Had he not given in, how long might he have ruled? It's purely speculation on my part. But had he not turned aside, he might have set the record, because God would not have been angry at this point. And so, to emphasize the point, what does God do? You pick up at verse 14 and he begins to raise up adversaries. Solomon begins to experience something in the latter years of his reign that he's not really had to deal with on any significant scale up to this point. Hadad the Edomite becomes an adversary, somebody that really should have been a nobody, no problem to him, becomes an adversary and a problem for him. He is of the royal house of Edom. When David was in Edom and Joab was the commander of the army, he had struck down every male in Edom. But now Hadad fled to Egypt and reconstituted the kingdom, comes back to haunt Israel. Hadad grew up, married, had a son, was a favorite of Pharaoh while he was in Egypt. Hadad wants his own rule, even though Pharaoh wants him to stay. And then you get down to verses 23, 24, 25. Here's reason. God raises up reason as well to cause problems for Solomon because of Solomon's unfaithfulness. Notice down here at verse 22, Pharaoh tries to reason with Hadad and says, what have you lacked with me that you want to go to your own country? But he said to him, let me depart. Why would he leave comfortable life in Egypt to go back and cause problems for Solomon? Because the Lord instigated him. Pick up down here at verses 23, 24, 25. Rezon, the son of Eliada, who had fled from his master Hadad Ezer, king of Zobah, and he gathered men about him and became a leader of a marauding band after the killing by David. And they went to Damascus and lived there and made him king of Damascus, was an adversary of Israel all the days of Solomon, doing harm as Hadad did. And he loathed Israel and reigned over Syria. When Solomon was faithful, these guys were not a problem. When Solomon turns away, now he's got trouble on every side. Pick up at verse 26. Here's Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zeradah, a servant of Solomon. Now here is a fellow Israelite. And he lifted up his hand against the king because the king built the Millo and closed up the breach of the city of David, his father. And notice what it says about Jeroboam. He's got a great resume. He was very able. Solomon saw that he was industrious. He gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. And at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, came and found him on the road. Ahijah had dressed himself in a new garment. The two of them were alone in the open country, and Ahijah laid hold of the new garment that was on him, tore it into 12 pieces, and said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon and will give you 10 tribes. But he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and the sake of Jerusalem. Jeroboam was an industrious man. capable, able. A lot of potential. Had been a servant of Solomon. But now he's going to rebel. Notice what's said here as well about Jeroboam. The prophet tells him why God is doing this. Because they have forsaken me, that is Solomon, and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the goddess of the god of Moab, Milcom, the god of the Ammonites. They've not walked in my ways, doing what's right in my sight. I'll not take the whole kingdom. I'll make him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David. But I'll take the kingdom out of his son's hand and give it to you 10 tribes. And I will take you, verse 37, and you shall reign over all. Now, look at what God offers him through the prophet. You shall reign over all that your soul desires. You shall be king over Israel. And if you will listen to all that I command you and will walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and my commandments as my servant David did, I will be with you and will build you a sure house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. Boy, you want to ask for a gold-plated guarantee? There it is. I will afflict the offspring of David because of this, but not forever. And how does Solomon hear about this? I don't know. I don't know how Solomon heard about this, but Solomon sought to kill Jeroboam, and Jeroboam flees off to Egypt, to Shishak, and stays there till Solomon dies. So he goes from being able, faithful, industrious servant of Solomon to being hunted as a rebel against Solomon because he's been chosen not to replace Solomon, but he's been chosen by God to rule over most of what Solomon was going to leave behind. Think about what Solomon is doing here at verse 40. Solomon sought to kill Jeroboam. But whose will is it that Jeroboam become a king? It's God's will. Now, Jeroboam's kingdom and lineage are no threat to Solomon's kingdom and lineage, because God is going to preserve the tribe of Judah along with Benjamin, which is basically an adjunct to Judah at this point. God is going to preserve Rehoboam, Solomon's heir. God is going to preserve Jerusalem and the temple. Why?
David's sake.
Okay, number one, for David's sake. Number two, because he had hallowed Jerusalem with his presence there. But in the overall scheme of things, number three, and most important, why?
Promise to Abraham.
Because of the promise. Because Jesus still has to come. The tribe of Judah still has to survive. The lineage of David has to continue to reign for God to fulfill the promise that dates back to Genesis chapter 3 of reconciliation and redemption through the blood of Christ. Solomon's heirs are no threat to Jeroboam. The continuation of Solomon's kingdom is no threat to Jeroboam. God promises Jeroboam, and Jeroboam is not of the tribe of Judah, he's an Ephraimite. So his lineage is entirely separate. God promises Jeroboam the same deal that he promised Solomon, basically, minus all the extravagant wisdom. And Solomon wanted to kill him. Think about where this puts Solomon. In Acts chapter 5, after Peter and John had been arrested and hauled before the Sanhedrin in chapter 4 for preaching and teaching, they had been sent out and thoroughly charged, commanded, threatened, don't you preach anymore in this man's name. And they went and told everybody among the saints what had happened, and they rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer. And then what happens to all 12 apostles? Now they're all 12 arrested in chapter 5, brought before the ruling council and beaten and threatened and so forth. Whether we ought to obey God or men, you choose. And some of the Sanhedrin even wanted to kill them. And you get down to Acts 5 and verse 39. And what does Saul's tutor, Gamaliel, say?
God, you can't fight against it.
He says, leave them alone, fellas. If this is from God, if this is something they made up, it'll collapse under its own weight. Christianity. But if it's from God, you can't fight it. And what's the warning he gives? You don't want to be found fighting against God. And what is Solomon doing right here in 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 40? Solomon is fighting against God. Solomon is actively fighting against God. And so we come to the last little paragraph, the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did, his wisdom. Are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? The time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Slept with his fathers, was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. Well, that's a good place for us to stop and take about a 13, 14-minute break. Questions or comments before we break?
Is there any record that God informed Solomon which servant was going to be that it would pass the kingdom on to, except for that one tribe of reserve?
Okay.
Specifically Jeroboam.
Is there any biblical record that God actually informed Solomon who he was going to give the other part of the kingdom to? Not that I'm aware of. Not that I have found. God was certainly angry, and it was just Ahijah, the prophet, and Jeroboam out on the road together. It's not like Jeroboam was selected in front of a crowd. It's just the two of them together. Did he go tell somebody? I don't know. How Solomon found out, I don't know.
That record doesn't seem to be in Chronicles.
No, it's not. It's only here. And that makes sense because the Chronicles is focused on Judah and Jeroboam is all Israel, Northern Kingdom. Other thoughts, other questions? Okay, we'll stop here and take about a 14, 15-minute break. So we have taken the kingdom away from Solomon.
Killed him off.
Solomon is now dead, and we begin in 1 Kings chapter 12. And Rehoboam is now ready to be king. Rehoboam apparently did not inherit any of Solomon's smarts. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. Why would they come to Shechem and not to Jerusalem? For the coronation of the king. Solomon was coronated in Jerusalem. Why would they go to Shechem? Simple explanation would be there's room there. When Solomon became king, David's kingdom was relatively wealthy, relatively powerful, but David was an aged man who was still alive, and Adonijah had tried to steal a march on everything by having himself crowned down in the valley below Jerusalem. And so at David's instruction, Solomon is summarily crowned right across the Kidron Valley in plain sight of everybody. But now Solomon has expanded the kingdom far beyond what it was in David's day. The people undoubtedly are more numerous, and Shechem has a lot of significance on a number of levels, not the least of which is that's where Abraham had originally settled. And of course, their relationship with God traces back to whom? Abraham. It's a wide open plains area along the Jordan River. It's an area where they can gather thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people if they want to crown him as king. And in the meantime, here comes Jeroboam. Jeroboam hears about it, and they sent and called him. And Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came. They approached Rehoboam. Now, couple of thought questions here. Who was it that sent for Jeroboam? It says they sent and called him. Who's the they? Yeah, them.
Those people.
The most likely explanation, since Jeroboam is of the tribe of Ephraim, and since he had been in charge of the forced labor in the territory of Ephraim, probably it's the elders of Ephraim. Now, we don't know that. That is speculation, but that would be a logical explanation for who it is. They sent for him. He's a man known for his ability, known for his capability. He had basically had a good reputation until Ahijah told him he was going to be king over 10 of the tribes, and Solomon found out and started hunting for him. So it would be logical that this is a well-known individual. He receives word, comes back, but notice he does not foment rebellion right off the bat. He is basically the spokesman for at least the tribe of Ephraim, if not most of the tribes. And it seems to be Jeroboam who is the spokesman when they approach Rehoboam and say, can you lighten our burden a little bit? Can you relieve our taxes? Why Shechem? Well, Shechem is associated with Abraham. Shechem is geographically a logical place. But what else is there here? Where is Shechem?
It's more centrally located.
Okay, it's more centrally located. What tribe? There you go. It's the territory of Ephraim. It's north. Ephraim is the tribe north of Judah, and it's geographically a large tribe. So their territory goes right down to the Jordan River, and Shechem is in the territory of Ephraim. Jeroboam is called from Egypt. He is de facto spokesman, it seems, for the 10 tribes. But there's also a flavor here, perhaps, that none of these men, none of these tribes were any too thrilled at the prospect of Rehoboam as king. Now, remember what Solomon had done. He starts out as a tremendous leader, wise and perspicacious and bringing prosperity and abundance that the people have never seen before. Things are just going up and up and up. But what else does he do as time goes by?
It makes it harder on the people.
That's right. He begins to levy taxes. He appoints 12 men to provide 1 month of the year from each tribe for the needs of the king's house. And how many people are they having to feed for 30 days at a stretch, basically?
A lot.
thousands, roughly speaking, about 14,000 people. That's a pretty heavy tax burden for each tribe, even if it is just once a year. But then on top of that, there's the levy of labor to transport all the materials associated with the temple and put it together. There's the levy of labor to build the king's palace. Now, David had already built a palace, but what does Solomon do? I'm sorry, the wives' quarters are not big enough. We need to knock out this wall and extend this for the next 14 miles because he needs more space. Took 13 years to build took twice as long almost to build his house as it did to finish the temple. Solomon is expanding, and that's great for the local economy on one level if you're a contractor. But on the other hand, if you're a laborer, yes, that's steady work. But inflation, price of everything is going to go up. And if you're part of the forced labor, now you're not a slave like some of the subjugated peoples, but still you're a draftee. Things have gotten tighter and tighter. And then what has Solomon done as time's gone by? He's built a huge cavalry and stationed them all over the countryside. And you've got horsemen and groomsmen and people that service them. And the cost of taking care of his enormous cavalry that he's not supposed to even have in the first place. Solomon has put a lot of burden on his people as time has gone by. And, you know, even a beloved king, when he raises taxes, gets some pushback and some resentment. And it's clear that the people of Israel were feeling the pressure by the time Solomon dies and ready for some relief. So, Jeroboam, spokesman for at least his own tribe, if not all of the other tribes besides Judah. Now, Judah has a vested interest in Rehoboam's success because, after all, he is the embodiment of Judah in his generation. He's the king, he's the ruler, and they're the kingly tribe. But all the other tribes, they're not too thrilled about this. And so, can you lighten the burden? Can you roll back taxes a little bit? It may well be that these other tribes didn't want Rehoboam to be king at all. And we're looking for an occasion to secede. Because that's what they're going to, that's God's design, God's plan at this point. So their unhappiness is not surprising. Go away, give me a few days to think about it. 3 days, come back and I'll give you an answer. All right. So what does Rehoboam do? He does what any reasonable king would do, consults with his advisors. There's a problem though. Rehoboam's a young man. Solomon was a comparatively old man. He consults with Solomon's advisors, and what advice does he get?
Back off a little.
Yeah.
I love you, man.
Dial the taxes down and they will love you forever. Do you suppose? Yes, we're going to step out on a little bouncy twig of speculation for just a moment. Do you suppose that had Rehoboam dialed the taxes back or even eliminated them, that the 10 tribes would have stayed with Judah?
God had already said they wouldn't.
Exactly. Had it not been the issue of taxes are leverage. But had it not been the issue of taxes, it would have been something else because God had already determined here's what's going to happen.
He knew this was coming.
And he had provided for this to come. That's right. So Rehoboam gets good counsel from a political standpoint from his father's advisors. And then he does what nearly every foolish young man is bound to do in such a situation.
To his friends.
He goes and talks to his friends and just assumes why,
They're smart as me.
those old fogies can't remember what it's like to be young. They don't, it's a new world, it's a new environment. And of course, his friends say, you better bear down on them. You better really tighten the screws or they're going to get away from you. So that's what he does. Now, is Rehoboam aware of the promise made to Jeroboam through Ahijah the prophet? It would be reasonable to assume that he is, because number one, his father had been hunting for Jeroboam, so he probably knew why. But number two, who's acting as the spokesman for all the discontented people in Israel? Jeroboam. So from Rehoboam's point of view, this guy is an existential threat to him. This guy is a problem. I need to hammer him down before this gets out of hand. And so even though he's had good advice from the older men, he's going to go with his boyhood chums, his friends. We've got a good thing going. Let's make it better for us. Tighten the screws. And that stiffens his spine to go back and give an unpopular answer. My father scourged you with whips. I'll scourge you with scorpions. I'll make it worse for you. I'll make it harder on you. I am the king, and don't you forget it. Well, two wrongs don't make something right. You've got two strong wills here and two different sections of the country. You've got Judah with one agenda and the rest of the tribes with another agenda. You think about it, Judah, more than any other tribe, had been the beneficiaries of all that Solomon had done in terms of building and enrichment and so forth, because where does all the wealth and power flow? Right
Jerusalem.
smack to Jerusalem. So Judah, more than any other tribe, has been, even though they have to contribute to the levy of forced labor, even though they're paying taxes too, they benefit more than any other tribe in the nation in real world material terms from what goes on in the other tribes. So they're not, on balance, they're not discontent, even if Rehoboam's going to raise taxes, because they're just one out of 12 tribes. But the others, they're not too happy. So come down here and notice, pick up at verse 16. Go ahead, Mike.
Something that jumps out of 7.
Uh-huh.
The concept of servant leadership.
Yeah.
Shepherds are servants, they lead by being servants. Part of their advice is not just like the load.
Mm-hmm.
If you will be a servant
Mm-hmm.
to these people today and serve them, it doesn't say how,
Right.
but a business principle now is servant leadership. It's going on. Well, God was onto this already, that
Oh,
is
yeah.
the strongest leadership style, is those
Yeah.
who serve.
Well,
The best leaders you get.
and the point is well taken. For those of you online, Mike is making the point that in verse 7, part of the good counsel that Rehoboam receives from the older counselors is be a servant to your people. Now, what does a servant king look like? Well, he's not going to get out and sweep streets and scrub gutters and things like that. But that whole notion, and in the business world today, as Mike was saying, the whole concept of servant leadership is where the conventional wisdom is going and has gone. But what is servant leadership in a nutshell?
What can I do for you?
It's leadership that is focused on benefiting those who are being led. In other words, in verse 7, when they say, if you'll be a servant to this people, they're telling Rehoboam, look, if you will rule not for your own benefit, but for the benefit and the prosperity of your people, then you'll be benefited by that.
You can see a stark contrast just today between Zelensky and Putin.
No.
The type of style of leadership
Yep.
that they have. You know, Zelensky is very much a hands-on with the people, and Putin is up at the top,
Yeah.
being very commanding and doesn't care really seemingly about his
Right.
soldiers or people.
Right. The Luann was just saying, you can see a good illustration of this in the conflict going on in Ukraine right now, where Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, is basically, he's in the trenches with his soldiers, and Putin, the Russian aggressor, is locked up in the Kremlin and keeping his distance from his own people, much less anybody else. He is focused on what's good for him, and Zelensky is focused on what's good for his people. And that's a good illustration of the difference between servant leadership and self-leadership.
Remember Jesus, he was to be greatest, but he'd be servant.
There you go. Jesus told the disciples, you want to be great, be servant. Be a servant. Look for the welfare of others. Think about this also. In about 350 years from this point, what is Jeremiah going to write to the captives who are already in Babylonian captivity before the fall of Jerusalem?
The one's about do good for where you're at.
He's going to, exactly. He is going to write to them and say, look, pray for the prosperity of the city where you are. Pray for the welfare of the city where you are. And that's the last thing those people wanted to hear, because the elders of Israel, who were already over there in captivity with Ezekiel, are spending all day, every day arguing with Ezekiel that no, this can't possibly be right for us to be here. And Jeremiah comes along, sends him a letter, says, not only is it right, you better pray that things go well there. Pray for God to bless that place, because you're going to be there a while, fellas. Well, come back over here. And so you see the outcome of this at verses 16 and 17. When all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, they answered the king, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel, look now to your own house, David. So Israel went to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. So there are a couple of things here to point out. Number one, the king's response was an arrogant one, and they recognized it for what it was. Number two, what portion do we have in you? Well, that's an arrogant response as well, because they're overlooking the fact that the thread of messianic prophecy all through from Abraham forward is tied to whom? It's tied to Judah. It's tied to the lineage of Judah. The tribes, the 10 tribes are basically saying, you can do nothing for us. We don't have any benefit out of you. And that's not right. Because for every faithful Israelite of that era, their hope of eternal salvation rests squarely in Judah and in Judah's prosperity and in Judah's continuance, because the line of the tribe of Judah is not David, it's not Solomon, certainly not Rehoboam, but it's the son of David, Jesus. And so you have an arrogant response to their request, and their response is more arrogance in return. What do we have to do with you? You've got nothing to offer us. That's not true. Now, notice at verse 17, all of the Jews of whatever tribe who lived in Judah nevertheless are ruled by Rehoboam. Well, that makes sense. They're in his territory. Whether they're loyal to him or not, the implication would seem to be that they are, but that makes sense that they would be ruled by him because they're in his territory. Notice verses 18 and 19, though. It seems that Rehoboam begins to recognize, ooh, I fouled up. I made a mistake. So he sends Adoram, the man who was overall in charge of all the forced labor, basically the guy that Jeroboam had answered to, Jeroboam's superior when he was working for Solomon. So he sends Adoram to basically to arbitrate, try to smooth things over a little bit. And this was not the right guy to send. Many years ago, we lived in a congregation where there was The congregation was situated in a city where there's a major Internal Revenue Service center. And there was a brother in the congregation, a deacon there, who was an IRS agent, a treasury agent. You know, there were men in that congregation, brothers and sisters in that congregation, that were uncomfortable being around that brother simply because he was a revenuer. He worked for the government in collecting taxes, basically enforcing tax law. And they were not comfortable. It's like they were afraid he was going to find out something about him and report him or something. And it was, in a few cases, it was very obvious. Well, who does Rehoboam send to try to arbitrate and negotiate? It's not a good idea to send the tax collector. And that's basically what Adoram is, the guy who's over all of this. And so at this point, they stone Adoram. And Rehoboam has to run. This all takes place in the plains of Shechem. And now it's uphill all the way to Jerusalem. And you can bet he didn't slow down until he got there and got the gates closed. Because it was not a happy time for him. Let's put it that way.
They saw him coming and thought, oh yeah, here he comes to lower the boom on us. Here's the labor guy.
Well, and that may well be, you know.
Yeah.
This is the guy that collects the taxes, enforces the forced labor. They may have seen him as he's coming to enforce the king's decrees. Regardless, Rehoboam has to flee or die. And from this point on, nobody but the tribe of Judah, which includes all of the Israelites in the territory of Judah, which would include the tribe of Benjamin. Of course, Benjamin is the smallest of the tribes, and for generations has basically been an adjunct of Judah. At this point, the only people that answer to Rehoboam from now on are the people in his territory. The 10 tribes, Israel, Ephraim, they're not going to respect him anymore. They're not going to answer to him anymore. Israel, notice verse 19, Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. Now that's an interesting way to put that, given that this was ordained by God. In rebellion against the house of David until this day. Why would it be described that way if this is part of God's plan?
Maybe the ordinary people didn't know that that was God's plan. They just knew that Rehoboam was going to be a terrible king.
Okay, maybe the common folks in the 10 tribes didn't know that this is actually ordained by God. They just knew they didn't like Rehoboam as king.
Well, human nature still makes choices. God works around those choices in some ways, but God has a plan, and our free will still operates. And sometimes we're short-sighted, and sometimes we do stupid stuff. And God still accomplishes what he wants to, whether we're cooperative, incooperative, ignorant, or whatever.
That's true. Mike was pointing out that free will is still in operation here, and God's plan doesn't necessarily involve changing people's attitudes about this. He can work around bad attitudes to accomplish his will. But notice as well, when is this being written? This is the history of the kings of Israel and Judah. And even if it's being written largely in real time, even if it's being recorded, if not on a daily basis, but even in the lifetime of Rehoboam at this point, what do such chronicles do? What's their perspective? They're always looking back at historical events from the perspective of the present. And so even in Rehoboam's lifetime, and remember, this 1st and 2nd Kings are not a day-by-day chronicle, but a summary of people and events. So looking back at this, even in Rehoboam's lifetime, what are the 10 tribes going to do in terms of rebellion against the house of David? Jeroboam is going to be crowned king. And it seems almost as if his very first act as king is to do what? He is going to establish his own religion
High places.
to separate the 10 tribes from Judah. And he's going to do it specifically under the aegis of it's too much trouble to go to Jerusalem. Now, what's his reasoning behind that? If the people keep going to Jerusalem for sacrifices and holy days and feast days and whatnot, they're gonna get lonesome for that kinship that they used to have, and they're gonna turn against me and kill me. So I've got to separate them. I've got to wedge against that. Behold your gods that brought you out of Egypt, Dan and Bethel. Anybody want to be a priest? Doesn't matter what tribe, come on. He's gonna create rebellion against everything that Judah represents, which is ultimately who? God, Jehovah God. And so we read here, Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. Well, to be in rebellion against the house of David in that day is effectively to be in rebellion against who? God. Because this is the lineage of the Savior.
But Solomon has set this primer.
Mm-hmm. Solomon set this in motion with his own foolishness.
They're already used to serving these foreign gods. They set it in motion for them.
Even if they have not been involved in it themselves up to this point, Solomon had set the precedent. You're right, Mike, by allowing this sort of thing to go on, and not just among the high places of the 10 tribes. Solomon had allowed this to go on there in Judah. So
do you think this is why they rejected Christ when he came? Because of the situation?
do I think that this is why the Jews in Jesus' day rejected him because of this situation back there? No, because who are we talking about in Jesus' day? The majority of those people were of the house of Judah. They weren't the 10 tribes. There were some. Remember when Cyrus gives the decree in 536 that Judah can go home, part of that decree also says any one of the 12 tribes that wants to can go home, but 99% of them don't. But in Jesus' day, the rejection by the scribes and the Pharisees and the leadership, remember the common people heard him gladly, but the rejection by the rulership, the roots don't go back to this. They're similar in that they're protecting their territory, they're protecting their power, their influence, their control. And so they're similar in that respect. Attitudinally, they're a lot like Rehoboam in some ways, but I don't see that there's any distinct connection between the two events. There's a lot of similarity though. More things change, the more they stay the same in that sense. So nobody but Judah supports Rehoboam from this point forward. Look at verse 20. When all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent, called him to the assembly, and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. Within their territories, there's no love lost for Rehoboam. And so Jeroboam ends up with 10 tribes. Rehoboam ends up with 1.5, basically, 2 tribes. And
with the 10 around them.
That's a point well taken. Judah is effectively landlocked. Now, the vast majority of Israel's territory is to the north and east, but nevertheless, you've got Simeon to the south. You've got other territories, and then of course you got the Philistines over on the coast that never have been fully eradicated. So Judah's not in a good position other than the fact that they've got the high ground. And their fortified cities are going to be located on high points that are easily defensible. But nevertheless, It's not a good situation. Rehoboam assembles Judah and Benjamin, 180,000 soldiers. He's going to, this shows he's not right bright, as one old brother used to say. He's going to take 180,000 soldiers, 18 divisions, and go try to subdue 10 tribes that would outnumber him by orders of magnitude. The only thing is, there's one thing that figures into this. 180,000 chosen warriors to fight against the house of Israel to restore the kingdom to Rehoboam, but the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, say to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people. Thus says the Lord, you shall not go up or fight against your relatives. Go home. So he's all ready to instigate civil war to try to hold on to his claim. And God says no. The only thing that prevents him is God. So in at the end of chapter 12, then we have the founding of the kingdom of Israel from verse 25 down to the end of the chapter. And Jeroboam first selects Shechem, the place that they had crowned Rehoboam, territory in Ephraim. That's going to be his capital. He built Shechem, that is, he fortified it. He made it a defensible place. You think about it, a city situated basically in the plains is not normally a very defensible location because you can approach it from any direction. One of the strengths of Jerusalem as a defensible site is that there's basically only one way in and one way out, and that's from the north. Every other direction you come to Jerusalem, you have to climb the hill to get there. And of course, anybody standing on the wall can drop rocks on you and throw rocks at you and shoot arrows at you. And if you do make it to the top of the wall, if they can manage to push you off, boy, it's a long way down. So it says a lot about Jeroboam and about the degree of security he must have felt in his role as king, that he reinforced and fortified basically a plains city. Now, the plus is you can see your enemies coming a long way off. But the minus is you can't do much to stop them getting there. So there may be a little bit of arrogance in this in its own right. But the next thing he does is to fundamentally change the character of the people in the nation that he rules. Look at verses 26 and 27. These verses are the key to everything else that happens in the history of Israel. There was nothing wrong with Jeroboam fortifying the city of Shechem. Nothing wrong with going out and building Penuel. He's king, he can do that. But Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David if this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem. Then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Let's stop right there. Everything that precedes the establishment of the false religion, the idolatry, the antipathy that's going to exist from then on, everything proceeds from one characteristic in Jeroboam's life. And that one characteristic is lack of trust. Go back and look again at the promise God made to Jeroboam. You just turn back a page or two and you see down here in chapter 11, if you will listen, if you will do, if you will keep my statutes and commandments, I will be with you just like I was with David. I will build you a sure house. Here's your chance, Jeroboam, to have your legacy last right up to the time of Christ. And here, Jeroboam said in his heart, Jeroboam did not trust God. Jeroboam did not believe God. And when we disobey God, what are we doing? We're manifesting in a tangible way lack of faith in God. Remember what happened to Moses at the water of Meribah? At Rephidim, God said, strike the rock and it'll give forth water. Moses struck the rock and it gave forth water, and they watered the people. And they came to Meribah, and what did God say? Speak to the rock. And what did Moses do? Struck the rock and spoke to the people. And what did God say about that? Almost in back-to-back verses, he says, because you didn't believe me, you didn't obey me. And therefore you don't get to go into the promised land. Jim, go ahead.
Why is it that they keep making golden calves? Is there something special about a calf that they think they can
They
do?
make golden calves. What is it about the calf? Well, you go back to their time in Egypt, and among the various and sundry deities that the Egyptians worshiped was a calf, a god embodied. I forget who.
Apis the bull.
Apis the bull. Somebody, yeah, you may have their name right. I forget the name that they credit him with, but among the various deities that the Egyptians worshipped, one of them was imagined in the form of a calf, in the form of a bull. You look at the plagues, you have lice and frogs and boils and all this other stuff, but what stands out? There is one that specifically targets their cattle, their livestock, because they worshiped a deity embodied in the image of a bull. That is you consider that they have 400 years of exposure to that. You consider also that during that 400 years in Egypt, there's nothing said in the scriptures about Israel's worship, is there? Now we go back to the days of Jacob and Isaac and Abraham before him, and they did offer sacrifices and they gave offerings. There was no priesthood, though. The patriarchs of the families were in charge of things religiously and spiritually. When they go into Egypt, there is no defined priesthood. They don't yet have the law. They're not Jews religiously. What was their experience religiously in Egypt? Exactly. They were surrounded by polytheism, by idolatry on all sides. They had been surrounded by idolatry on all sides in the promised land, in Canaan. You go back to the roots from which Abraham sprang in Ur of the Chaldees, and most of the Chaldeans were idol worshipers as well. When do they get rid of their affinity for idolatry?
After captivity, they.
Maybe with David.
In the sense of images and statues, it's Babylonian captivity, where they finally make a clean break with that. But even then, they don't fully devote themselves to the Lord, because you come down to the first century, Jesus goes into the temple on 2 separate occasions and cleanses the temple with the words, "My Father's house shall be a house of prayer," and you've made it what? A den of thieves, a den of robbers. What was going on in the temple grounds right there? You've got the currency exchange, the cambio, from which the high priest and his cronies took a cut. And you've got the sale of sacrificial animals, from which they also got a percentage. They'd turned it into a marketplace because they worshiped what? Power that money brought them. So in one sense, they never did leave idolatry behind. But it's interesting, several times in the Old Testament, you find the statement by various prophets that they never did leave the idols behind in Egypt. You know, you can take in a sense, you can take the idol worshiper out of Egypt, but you can't take Egypt out of the idol worshiper. And that's the root of their problem in a lot of ways. So Jeroboam establishes his kingdom, builds a fortified city, a fortified capital, seemingly is prospering, doing well, builds up Peniel, but now he establishes this ridiculous false religion. He makes religion easy. It's too much trouble, O Israel. Well, that's an excuse, isn't it? It's too much trouble. How many times a week do we have to come to church? How much do I have to give? How many times a day do I have to pray? How long? Do we have to sing 6 songs every worship service? Yeah, do we have to come? Yeah.
Too much trouble.
Hey, we've got Zoom. Do we even have to come at all?
Yeah, don't.
That's exactly the emotion that Jeroboam plays on to embody his mistrust, his lack of faith in God's promise. Now, all of this traces back to one man being unwilling to trust God. Can you imagine how differently things might have gone had Jeroboam trusted God? But he didn't. So come down here, the king took counsel, made 2 calves of gold, took count. His advisors suggested some of this apparently. 2 calves of gold, one at Bethel, one at Dan, one at this end of the country and one at that end of the country. All right, all you folks in Simeon and whatnot, you go here. All you folks in Manasseh and Ephraim and whatnot, you go here. This thing became a sin for the people, went as far as Dan to be before one. He made temples on high places, appointed priests from among all the people who were not of the Levites. Anybody that wants to can be a priest. Appointed a feast on the 15th day of the month, like the feast that was in Judah, offered sacrifices on the altar, did the same thing in Bethel. Corrupted the people. That's sin. Exodus 20 and verse 4, no other gods before me. A new priesthood from every class, that is the lowest of the low, could be priests. Change the feast days. But look over at 2 Chronicles for just a minute, chapter 11. The parallel, the little bit of parallel that there is here. In 2 Chronicles chapter 11, you find an interesting little tidbit at verses 13 through 15. The priests and the Levites who were in all Israel and presented themselves to him from all the places where they lived. The Levites left their common lands and their holdings and came to Judah and Jerusalem because Jeroboam and his sons cast them out from serving as priests of the Lord. And he appointed his own priests for the high places and for the goat idols and for the calves that he had made. And those who had set their hearts to seek the Lord God of Israel came after them from all the tribes of Israel to Jerusalem to sacrifice to the Lord, the God of their fathers. They strengthened the kingdom of Judah. And for 3 years, they made Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, secure. They walked for 3 years in the way of David and Solomon. So Jeroboam's changes were not without contention, shall we say. The leaders of the tribes, the elders, the men of influence seem to have been solidly behind him. The Levites were not. And that speaks well of the Levites. You know, the Levites get a bad rap And the priests get a bad rap a lot of times in biblical history for not doing what they ought to do, not teaching, not being the influence they should have been. Here, they basically were invited to leave. We don't want you here. Well, from a political point of view, that makes sense, because what would they be doing? If they're faithful to the Lord, what can they do among the 10 tribes?
I need to go to Jerusalem.
Yeah, cry out against this false worship. This is wrong. You can't do this. You ought to go to Jerusalem, do the right thing. Well, fine. If that's how you feel, you can just leave. And they were an asset to Rehoboam. I'll be glad when we get past kings whose names don't rhyme. In chapter 13 now, and this is really where we'll wind up here in chapter 13, we have an unnamed man of God, a prophet, no name recorded here, but he comes out of Judah. We don't know who he is, but he comes from the territory of Judah to Bethel while Jeroboam is there to make an offering. Now, he prophesies of Josiah. He tells Jeroboam, here's what's going to happen. O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, and he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who make offerings on you, and human bones shall be offered on you. Now, even in idol worshiping Israel, that was a bridge too far. Human sacrifice was not something they were prepared to embrace. And the idea that human bones would be offered on these altars, well, even for them, that would defile the altars, make them unusable, uninhabitable. But the important thing here, this man specifies Josiah by name 330 years before the fact. Almost 3.5 centuries before the act takes place. This prophet says, here's what's going to happen, and here's who's going to do it, and here's his family tree. So you go to 2 Chronicles chapter 34 and verse 5, also 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse 10. I got to learn to write bigger in my Bible. And guess what? 330 years later, Josiah comes along and defiles these altars. 21 times, though, in the New Testament, Jeroboam is mentioned. And 21 times in the New Testament, he is Jeroboam who caused Israel to sin, or Jeroboam who taught Israel to sin. Every time he's mentioned, that's his epitaph. That's it. You look at what God offered him. He could have been Jeroboam the magnificent, Jeroboam the faithful, Jeroboam the mighty, Jeroboam the paragon of virtue. And here we are almost 3,000 years later, and who is he? He's Jeroboam who taught Israel to sin. The sign is given, the name is given as a proof of the prophecy. And from this point on, at verse 4, Jeroboam begins to put everything about his kingdom above the Lord's authority. Look at verse 4. When the king heard the saying of the man of God, which he cried against the altar at Bethel, Jeroboam stretched out his hand from the altar, saying, "Seize him!" And his hand, which he stretched out against him, dried up. It withered so that he could not draw it back. The altar also was torn down, the ashes poured out from the altar, according to the sign of the man of God given by the word of the Lord. The king said, you want comedy in the Bible? Here it is. The man says, "Seize him." and is immediately afflicted. And what's the next thing he does? Pray for God to heal me. He recognizes and respects God's power for the moment. And go down to verse 7, and what's the very next thing he does? He uses another means of distraction for the people, bribery and compromise. And his refusal to be faithful, verses 8, 9, and 10, is based on God's specific commandments. The king offers bribery and compromise in verse 7. Come home and refresh yourself. I'll give you a reward. If you gave me half your kingdom, half your house, I will not go in with you. I will not eat bread or drink water. For so it was commanded me by the word of the Lord not to do this. So he went by another way and did not return. His refusal to agree with Jeroboam is based on God's very specific commandments. But then you have the treachery of an older prophet of God. In verses 11 through 32, which carries us most of the way through the chapter, is a study in tragedy on a variety of levels, not just for the fate of the prophet here. An older prophet. Now, we don't know who the older prophet is. There's nothing that indicates that he's anything less than a faithful prophet of God up to this point. But an old prophet lived in Bethel. His sons came and told him everything that had happened. Which way did the man of God go? A question here at verse 11. There's a prophet of God right here in Bethel, where the altar is located, where this travesty of worship is taking place. Why isn't he out there decrying what Jeroboam is doing? Why does God have to send a prophet clear from Judah up there to do that? Doesn't seem to speak well of this man, does it? So he sends word, and then he goes, finds the young man, come home with me. I can't do it. Why did the older prophet want this young man to come to his house? You suppose it's a guilty conscience for not rebuking Jeroboam himself? Is it just a desire for fellowship with someone of like mind, somebody that's not bought into Jeroboam's foolishness? You know, the old man may have been feeling very isolated and alone. All the Levites, the priests have gone, and here he's feeling left alone. That still doesn't answer why didn't he speak out. But you know, when you're all alone, and then you discover you're not all alone, the idea of being with somebody of like precious faith it's a powerful draw. Why did he want this young man to come home with him? Did he want to see if maybe the Lord had more to say? I don't know. The scripture doesn't give us an explanation for why. It just states the fact. You look down to verses 16 and 17, though, the offer is made, come home with me, eat bread with me, and so forth. No, I can't do it. Here's what the Lord told me to do. And so the older prophet lies. What in the world would persuade a prophet of God to lie? No Christian has ever told a lie, have they? That was phrased in the form of a question.
Oh, okay. How much is gonna be like?
Well, go to Acts chapter 5. Who do we meet in Acts chapter 5, verses 1 through 13? Ananias and Sapphira. What? How is it that you've let Satan put it in your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit? You haven't lied to men, but to God. Abraham lied, so did
Like
Isaac.
it.
Yeah. Abraham did it, so did Isaac. Why would any faithful child of God lie? Because temptation is strong and sometimes we're foolishness. We're foolish, we're weak. But the other side of that coin, verses 18 and 19, the older prophet lies. Why doesn't the younger prophet go to God for confirmation? Don't know. Carelessness on his part, maybe. Relief, maybe, at not feeling like he's the only one in all this hostile territory. Don't know. But as he goes home with the man, now at verses 20, 21, 22, the older prophet actually receives a revelation from God. Because you've disobeyed the word of the Lord, not kept the commandment that the Lord your God commanded you. You've come back, you've eaten bread, drunk water in the place which he said, don't do that. Your body will not come to the tomb of your fathers. Boy, don't you know it was hard for that man to head for home after that? The prophecy condemns the younger prophet for disobedience, and it forces the truth out of the older man's mouth. That younger man, imagine how he must have looked at that older prophet at that point. That's not what you told me. You lied to me. And the prophecy is fulfilled very quickly in verses 23 and 24. Neither of the animals that are mentioned here act according to their normal nature. You look at verse 23, 24. He saddled the donkey that the prophet whom he brought back. And as he went, a lion met him on the road, killed him. His body was thrown in the road. The donkey stood beside it, and the lion stood beside the body. Now, folks will sometimes object, there are no lions in that part of the world. Not anymore. But the Asiatic lion, which is simply a somewhat smaller version of the familiar African lion, actually did roam that part of the world up until about 500 years ago. And that doesn't take into account all of the various other animals in that part of the world that are recognized under the general description of lion, things that we would consider a panther or something of that sort. So you have a large feline carnivore, quite capable of killing a man, who kills a man and then sits down and waits beside it.
With the donkey.
Along with the donkey that normally would have run off, kicked and fled. Neither animal acts according to its nature. News travels fast, especially news of a situation like this. You see a body in the road with a donkey and a lion next to it. You're gonna, the least you're gonna do is pull out your cell phone and take a picture of that and post it on Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook. News travels fast. Well, the old prophet wants to be honored, it seems. So he buries the young man's body, has it buried, and then he wants to be buried with him. It's the man of God who disobeyed the word of the Lord. The Lord has given him to the lion, and the word comes back. They go gather up the body, brought it back to the city to mourn and to bury him. When I die, you bury me here with him. And notice at verse 32, for the saying he called out by the word of the Lord against the altar in Bethel and against all the houses of the high places that are in the cities of Samaria shall surely come to pass. Makes you wonder if he wasn't thoroughly convinced up to this point. But brother, if he wasn't, he sure is now, isn't he? So you come to the summary of this at verses 33 and 34. After this thing, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way, but made priests for the high places again from among all the people. Any who would, he ordained to be priests of the high places. Salud. And this thing became sin to the house of Jeroboam so as to cut it off and destroy it from the face of the earth. This was the thing that nullified all the promises God offered to Jeroboam. One thing with consequences that flowed for hundreds of years forward until Israel and everything that Jeroboam thought he was going to preserve for himself and his legacy was demolished in 721 BC by the Assyrians because of Israel's sin. Time to stop here. Questions, comments, thoughts, complaints. We'll look at Jehoshaphat and Jehu and Ahab and all those guys next time.
Funny that the old prophet's lie is, right? Essentially, angel of God told me to tell you to do exactly the opposite of what God said. And in Galatians 1, the we
Or an angel from heaven.
From heaven.
There you go.
Any other gospel.
Let him
Let him be
accursed.
accursed.
Good point. Michael Richardson pointed out the irony that the old prophet's lie is an angel told me to tell you to do exactly opposite of what God told you personally. And Paul comes along in the New Testament and says, though we are an angel from heaven, preach to you any gospel other than that which you've received, let him be cursed. I wonder if Paul was thinking about that as he wrote those words. Other questions, thoughts, comments?
Just a little interesting side note in this, in verse
Mhm.
30, when they lay the true prophet,
Yeah.
the corpse in his own tomb, the old guy says, they mourned over him saying, alas.
Alas, my brother. Yeah.
Have you ever seen a Masonic funeral?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
That's what they say.
There is, if you look at verse 30, Jim Pelfrey was just pointing out, if you look at verse 30, when they have a funeral for the young prophet and they put him in the grave, the old prophet mourns over him, and the words that he speaks are, alas, my brother. And the observation was, if you've ever watched the pageantry and pomp of a Masonic funeral, and by the way, Freemasonry is a false religion, period, paragraph, end of story. If you want to argue about it, we'll sit down and do it. I'll demonstrate it from their own writing. But in the pomp and pageantry of a Masonic funeral, what do they say at the graveside? Alas, my brother, alas, my brother. As part of the ritual that goes with burying a Mason. Other questions, other comments?
It was interesting to me too, when Jeroboam's hand was withered because he was about to arrest the prophet who had foretold the future. He immediately said, pray to your God to restore it. Like,
Yes.
he's already realized that he's no longer Jeroboam's God.
Yeah. It's interesting, as Jim pointed out, when the young prophet cried out, Jeroboam pointed him out, stretched out his hand to point him out, say, arrest him, and his hand is withered, then his request is pray to your God. Not pray to God, pray to your God. There's a break in his thinking even there. What's astonishing from my perspective is God was willing to heal him.
And he didn't get the message.
And he still didn't. You're right. And
I
he
think
still
that makes some change.
he still doesn't get the message. You're right.
Gotcha, Lord.
Yeah. Well, other thoughts, other questions, comments? For those of you online, I did have a handout of some random charts and things, some maps and other things. I will try to get those scanned and send those to you as an attachment to the email with the link for the archive of tonight's class. So look for that sometime tomorrow, Lord willing. Thank you for being here. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.